Hello everyone. Let's take a look at today's major news you shouldn't miss from March 3, 2026. Across global capital markets, the most discussed topic today is still international oil prices. The global benchmark Brent crude briefly surged above $85 per barrel, reaching its highest level since mid-2024. Meanwhile, U.S. benchmark crude, WTI, rose about 8%, approaching $77 per barrel. Analysts from ANZ Bank said the longer the conflict continues, the greater the impact on the oil market will be. Now, regarding the Wall Street Journal's report, I'd like to share a perspective with everyone. Why did investors panic today, while yesterday the market seemed relatively calm? Behind this shift in sentiment lies a major concern. Many people are asking, why, after 3 days of intense U.S. and Israeli strikes, has Iran's missile barrage still not been contained? Today, even with many Middle Eastern countries deploying large air defense systems, massive waves of Iranian missiles still caused significant damage. So the question is, why have more than 3,000 missiles launched by the U.S. and Israel against Iran still failed to suppress Iran's missile attacks? And why is Iran still able to launch more than 700 ballistic missiles per day in retaliation? According to analysis by Reuters, there are 5 main reasons, and unfortunately, these problems are very difficult to solve. As this information spread, global capital markets became increasingly nervous, not only worried that the war could drag on for a long time, but also concerned that it could spiral out of control and spread to a wider region. Let's look at those 5 reasons. First, Iran's response is essentially a saturation attack. From Iran's perspective, launching a massive volume of missiles allows some to break through defenses. Currently, the air defense systems used by the U.S., Israel, and many Arab countries, mostly American-made, have an interception success rate of around 90% or slightly higher. But that still means about 10% get through. Those missiles that slip through can cause serious damage. For example, some Iranian missiles reportedly struck iconic buildings in Dubai. In practice, intercepting one missile often requires 2 interceptor missiles to ensure success. If Iran launches around 800 missiles per day, then the U.S., Israel, and their regional partners must use over 1,500 expensive interceptor missiles daily. This creates a severely unbalanced exchange, and the rate at which defensive missiles are consumed is extremely fast. Even then, there's still a 10% leakage rate. This is one reason Iran's missile barrage has been so difficult to stop. Second, Iran is attacking multiple targets from multiple directions, rather than focusing on a single location. This makes it extremely difficult for air defense systems to cover every vulnerability. Every country inevitably has weak points in its defense network. Third, the economic cost of interception is extremely asymmetric. If this turns into a war of attrition, and after 4 days the missile launches still haven't been stopped, that's exactly what it becomes. Iran's main ballistic missiles cost only a few $100,000 each. But interceptor missiles used by the U.S., Israel, and their allies cost between $2 million and $10 million each. That means defending against Iran's missile barrage costs 10 to 100 times more than launching the missiles. Fourth, Iran is using a tactical combination of low-cost drones and missiles. Large numbers of drones are launched first to exhaust lower-level defenses and distract radar systems, creating openings for missiles to strike their targets. This tactic has shown some effectiveness. Fifth, Iran also has geographical advantages. From a defensive perspective, early warning is extremely challenging. Iran launches missiles from multiple concealed sites within its territory, including underground missile facilities. This shortens the warning time available to U.S. and Israeli satellite and radar systems. Iran also has a large and complete missile stockpile, while interceptor missiles used by the U.S. and Israel must be transported across oceans, relying on limited regional inventories. In fact, media reports in the past 2 days suggest that some air defense missiles originally allocated to Taiwan and South Korea may be redirected to the Middle East. Based on these 5 factors, it's easy to understand why investors are worried. 2 questions are especially concerning. First, how long can this 1-to-2 defensive exchange ratio be sustained? Second, with a 10% leakage rate, how much damage could those missiles ultimately cause? Capital markets tend to look at problems differently from politicians or the media. Political and military discussions often focus on how the US and Israel attack Iran. But investors focus on a different question: how can Iran's missile barrage be defended against, and how can the risks and losses be minimized? In the coming days, whether the US and Israel can contain Iran's missile attacks will become critically important. If they cannot locate Iran's missile stockpiles or destroy its launch capabilities, then this kind of back-and-forth missile exchange could become extremely dangerous. Today, US media also acknowledged that a nuclear fuel storage bunker in central Iran has not been destroyed, despite 3 days of bombing by the US and Israel. Part of the reason is that the facility is deep underground, protected by 7 meters of reinforced concrete. As a result, the situation now appears far more serious than it did at the beginning of the conflict. And this, ultimately, is the underlying reason why global capital markets panicked today. Now let's move to the second important story I want to share with everyone. A statement made yesterday by U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has triggered a major backlash in American public opinion. His remarks have been interpreted in different ways by different media outlets, leading to intense debate across the United States. For example, the British newspaper Daily Mail ran a headline claiming that Rubio had effectively admitted Israel forced the United States into war with Iran, which sparked widespread anger. Many other media outlets in the U.S. reported similar interpretations. However, outlets like Fox News and the Wall Street Journal defended Rubio, arguing that his words were taken out of context and that he did not mean that Israel forced America into the conflict. Still, a large number of media organizations concluded that Rubio's comments suggested that the U.S. attack on Iran was influenced or pushed by Israel. Because of this, even though the war has just begun, a major debate has already erupted inside the United States over why this war was started. So it's worth examining an important question: was the United States actually dragged into this war? I'd like to share 4 key pieces of background to help understand the situation. First, what exactly did Rubio say? Many people on social media have been quoting Rubio, but the quotes vary widely. Some say he said one thing, others say he said something completely different. So what were his actual words? The statement came from a video recorded yesterday afternoon, when Rubio spoke to reporters at the U.S. Capitol. He essentially made 3 key points. His first point was that the U.S. operation aims to eliminate Iran's ballistic missile threat to American naval assets. In other words, the goal is to remove the missile capability that threatens U.S. forces. His second point emphasized the idea of preemptive action, and this is the part that triggered the most controversy. Rubio said intelligence indicated that if Iran were attacked by either the United States or Israel, Iran had already authorized its frontline commanders to automatically retaliate against U.S. forces. Those were his words. In other words, Iran's position is that if anyone attacks Iran, Iran will respond by attacking U.S. military targets. Then Rubio made his third statement, which added to the controversy. He said, "We know Israel is going to take action. We know that this will trigger attacks against U.S. forces. And we also know that if we do not strike first, we will suffer greater casualties." So his 3 points together were: Iran's ballistic missiles threaten U.S. forces. Iran has declared it will retaliate against U.S. military targets if attacked. The U.S. knows Israel will act, which means American forces will be targeted. Therefore, according to Rubio's argument, the United States must strike first. Now, how people interpret these remarks largely depends on their political perspective. Some people hear Rubio's words and conclude that Israel's decision to strike Iran forced the United States to join the conflict, because Iran had already declared it would retaliate against American forces. From that perspective, it sounds like the U.S. had little choice but to act alongside Israel. But others interpret the same remarks very differently. They argue that if the U.S. already knows Iran intends to attack American forces, then preemptive action is simply a matter of defending U.S. troops. They also argue that Israel's actions against Iran are aimed at preventing Iran from obtaining nuclear weapons, which would also threaten the United States. From that perspective, Israel is not forcing the U.S. into war, it is confronting a shared threat. So it's easy to see why the debate has become so intense. There is no clear consensus. And today, American public opinion remains deeply divided over Rubio's remarks. Second, Netanyahu responds to the controversy. Today, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu publicly rejected the claim that Israel dragged the United States into war with Iran. The fact that Netanyahu felt compelled to respond while the war is still ongoing shows how serious this controversy has become. Netanyahu offered 3 arguments. First, he said Donald Trump is one of the strongest leaders in the world and cannot be manipulated by anyone. In other words, he argued that the claim that Israel forced the United States into war underestimates Trump's independence. Second, Netanyahu argued that Iran threatens not only Israel but also the United States itself. According to him, if Iran develops nuclear weapons, it would pose a direct threat to the American homeland, not just to Israel. Therefore, he said, this war is not simply about helping Israel. Third, Netanyahu appeared slightly frustrated with Rubio's phrasing. Rubio suggested that because Israel would act, the U.S. had to participate. Netanyahu countered that Israel and the United States operate in strategic coordination. In other words, Israel's actions against Iran were not independent decisions that forced America's hand, but rather part of a shared strategic plan between the two countries. If Netanyahu is telling the full truth, then Rubio's wording may simply have been imprecise. But if Rubio's remarks accurately reflected the situation, then Netanyahu's explanation might be somewhat forced. Third, has Rubio's explanation calmed the debate? The answer is no. Inside the United States, reactions fall into 3 major camps. First, in Congress, opinions are sharply divided. Most Republican lawmakers accept Netanyahu's argument. They believe the Iranian regime is the main source of instability in the Middle East, and that destroying its military capability is the only path toward long-term regional stability. They see Netanyahu's statement as an act of moral clarity and leadership. But critics and opposition voices argue that Rubio's words clearly suggest the U.S. was pulled into the conflict because Israel was determined to attack. Second, some lawmakers who oppose the war argue that Israel also misled Washington about how easy the war would be. They say Israel repeatedly suggested that the conflict would be quick and successful, but the first 3 days of fighting have been far more complicated than expected. Third, skepticism is not limited to Democrats. Some America First Republicans and isolationists have also expressed doubts. For example, Senator Rand Paul and Representative Thomas Massie have both questioned Netanyahu's explanation and suggested the United States may indeed have been dragged into the conflict. Meanwhile, public opinion on social media remains highly divided and chaotic. Rubio's remarks have clearly ignited a major national debate, and the controversy is likely to continue growing, especially since it provides arguments for the anti-war movement. Fourth, Trump's report to Congress. There is another important background factor. Yesterday, President Trump officially notified Congress about the military operation against Iran, as required by U.S. law. Under American law, the president must inform Congress within 3 days of initiating military action. Yesterday happened to be the 3rd day. Trump explained why the operation began, what has happened so far, and what future plans may look like. According to U.S. law, once the president reports to Congress, Congress must decide whether to formally authorize the war. If Congress does not approve a declaration of war within 60 days, the president is required to end military operations. At the moment, it seems unlikely that Congress will formally declare war on Iran. This raises an interesting question: if Congress does not approve the war, will Trump be forced to stop after 60 days? During his report yesterday, Trump made an interesting comment. He emphasized that no U.S. ground troops have been deployed, and that the operation currently consists only of airstrikes. Some American media interpreted this statement as a strategic signal to Congress. By framing the operation as limited airstrikes rather than a full-scale war, Trump may be arguing that the 60-day limitation does not apply in the same way. In other words, even after 60 days, Congress may not have the legal power to force the president to stop limited military strikes. So from these 4 perspectives, we can see that Trump appears to have a fairly clear strategic framework. His communication with Congress also gives him some flexibility in determining how long the war might continue. This has been Anti-Noise Intelligence. tracking the world so you stay ahead of it. Thank you for listening, and make sure to tune in again tomorrow.